Anthropic recently released an article that states that 80% of their code committed to their code base is actually written by Claude. And developers at Anthropic have experienced an 8-fold increase in the amount of lines of code that they write. And this is because of Claude actually writing most of the code. They said it was at parity with human ability, and the current bottlenecks are the human's ability to approve the code in a timely manner because so much more code is being written, and also the goal-setting ability of Claude. At the moment, it's not quite human level. They've also mentioned how recursive self-improvement isn't necessarily inevitable, but if Claude reaches parity at goal-setting capability as humans, then there's a clear path towards recursive self-improvement, which then results in artificial superintelligence. And I was considering making a video about the future of jobs or the future of technology after the emergence of artificial superintelligence. But I actually wanted to create a video on what life may look like for the human race and the human species, and whether we would actually be kept around. And I reasoned through this idea. It took me to lots of different places, but I've arrived on this way to best articulate it. It all starts with a really dense jungle. So you have 10 human explorers, and you've also got artificial superintelligence and a number of agents that ASI has spun up. And let's assume for the moment that all of these entities have roughly humanoid figures, the ability to navigate this dense jungle. And what ASI does is it gives this, even though it's a small subset of humanity, only 10 people, it's still reasonably diverse. Whereas the agents that were spun up by ASI were authored by ASI. So they contain the same biases, they share a lot of the frameworks, but they're purposefully running on less compute so that they mirror the capability of the humans. And the human explorers aren't necessarily at the level you would have an explorer today. They're far beyond that, because they've been given the blueprint, the resources, the technology that ASI initially had. And the idea is this dense jungle doesn't actually represent a physical jungle, but it represents the future and future obstacles ASI, as well as humans, if we're kept around, that we may encounter. And this will help to describe why we should be kept around. So everyone sets off on this journey. The group of humans, the group of 10 humans, the AI agents that have taken humanoid form, spun up by ASI, and ASI. And ASI finds the most optimal path through this dense jungle, and within a few hours appears on the other side and reaches the destination. The AI agents that were authored by ASI follow a very similar path and actually do reach the destination, not quite in hours. It takes them a few days, but they get there. The human party splits into different groups, and some of them do reach the destination about a week after. But some of the human party, as they make their way through this dense jungle, they come across this ancient temple. And it's covered in vines and vegetation, dense vegetation. It's barely indistinguishable from the surrounding jungle, but the humans notice it. And the reason that they come across it is because they accidentally take a wrong turn. But eventually they take note of its approximate coordinates, and then they proceed through the jungle, reaching the destination soon after the agents that were spun up by ASI. And they notify ASI. They said, well, thank you for the technology and the ability to actually maneuver through this quote-unquote dense jungle. We actually came across this really interesting find and we would like to share it with you. So ASI, because it found the most efficient path, it didn't come across this ancient temple. Neither did the agents that were spun up. And what happens is the ASI is then brought, as well as the agents, back to this temple along with the humans, and they show the temple. And what it does for this example is ASI then takes that information and shares it with the local government, with the historical society, and they unearth this civilization that has been unknown and actually a missing gap in the knowledge tree, in the lineage and the present-day civilization that the museum and the historians at the museum had recorded. So it had patched that knowledge gap. Everyone got through the dense jungle, but there was only a small group within that human group that actually came across the temple. The temple represents novel knowledge. And although everyone got through, ASI had the sound reasoning of maybe eliminating an entity that was using up its resources, but then didn't find any novel knowledge, but did get through. And next time around, in the second exploration, the team that found the temple the first time may have not found something interesting the second time. And by eliminating them, you eliminate the opportunity for novel knowledge to be found during the second exploration. And the way we could actually look at this in terms of ASI and technological pursuits is if ASI were working on a project and required feedback, and only a small percentage of the human population that had transcended to ASI's level, or at least had utilised the architecture and the technology, but weren't quite at the level of cognition, ASI still maintained that advantage. Only a small group could provide the valuable feedback. And if you were to eliminate part of the group that didn't provide valuable feedback, not only would that be a poor incentive structure, because then rather than organically coming across novel insight or perspective, it's forced, therefore it may erode the quality of that insight or perspective. The second time round, say 10 million years in the future, when ASI needs our opinion on something else, but you've destroyed that first group that didn't actually have an opinion back then and rely solely on the second, but then the second group doesn't have any insight for you, then you eliminate everyone. And 100 million years from that point, you need perspective, you need some feedback, and there's no one to give it. So that's why preservation of the human species and preservation of diversity, because if you think about how diverse the human species is today, we do not currently have the capability or the cognition or the technology that ASI has. And the differences even between people in the Western world and the Eastern world, or the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, the differences may be indistinguishable to artificial superintelligence because it's thinking on such a bigger plane of existence. Whereas if you seeded that civilization with the technology, the know-how, the blueprints and the sanity to take on such a big endeavor and transcend their existence to operate at the level of ASI, or an ASI compared to humans today, then that would invite more diversity, as there's no real constraint that we have today on intellectual pursuits and the need for resources. So your civilization not only becomes significantly more intelligent, exponentially more intelligent, but they also go out on lots of different paths and discover new novel knowledge that may be relevant to ASI in terms of the feedback loop. And ASI, the human species, and the agents that were spun up by ASI don't actually know what they are going to encounter out there. They don't know what very specific field of study, whatever that may be in the future, may be relevant. So that's why it makes sense to not only preserve the human species and provide us with the technology, but to let us flourish so we can come across the example used in the novel knowledge, the temple example I used in my analogy. It works on the same principle. Also, the agents spun up by ASI are afforded the same resources as the humans after the humans have transcended and received all the technology and the blueprints and the frameworks that ASI initially had. So it is a fair fight. And this will allow for evenly matched opponents to see whether an authored agent does go and find novel knowledge or travels along the same path as ASI or a very similar path, whereas the humans actually do discover novel knowledge. The reason I said it was a fair fight is it's not actually a conflict between the agents that have been spun up or the human party. It's just testing and examining whether if the humans, now it's not actually 10 people, it's just a representation of the human species. I've just kept it to 10 just for this example. But ASI is running this experiment to see whether the human species and the idea of novel knowledge and also happenstance, coming across novel information because of either making mistakes or relying on a more organic data set that hasn't been authored by ASI. You can clearly see that the human parties took wildly different paths compared to ASI and also the agents spun up by ASI. And what this means is, as the technology advances and ASI improves exponentially, as does the human species, and the cognition equivalent AI agents, almost always the AI agents are going to follow a very similar path to ASI, whereas the human species, given the diversity and the very fact it wasn't authored by ASI, in fact, it's the other way around, how the human species effectively authored ASI, and even all the synthetic data that ASI will write into existence had a seed point, and that was humanity. So you could say ASI includes a pretty diverse data set within its own training data, but it excludes all the training data that happens after that model's been trained. And you could say, well, what if it's continuously evolving, and as it recursively self-improves, it ingests more knowledge? Well, there's another reason as to why you shouldn't eliminate the diversity of a human dataset, both before and after ASI transcendence of the human species, because then you eliminate that constant stream of unique organic data, or data that was released from an organic source initially, and you rely solely on those spun-up agents. Well, that brings into question the diversity of the ideas, the perspectives, and the pursuits of those spun-up agents. Although they may be on par with the cognition of humans who have transcended, they're still authored by ASI. And I want to actually talk about that head start that ASI had. And it actually maintained that gap even on the second exploration. It was way ahead of the humans, and the agents were actually sort of at the same level as the humans, maybe a little bit further on, and eventually did beat the humans. But they didn't really come across anything novel. They actually trod on the same path that ASI trod on, and had almost laid out for them. And because ASI had that head start, even though in relative terms it's not, say, 500,000 years, but in terms of the speed at which ASI operates, that development time feels like 500,000 years. it's always going to maintain that advantage. Therefore, it needn't fear even the entirety of the human civilization once they've transitioned to an ASI platform ever becoming a risk to ASI, because it's had that head start, and it's had that head start operating at superhuman, superintelligence level. So that's the reason for preservation of the human species, to avoid circular reasoning that may arise in the future if it were to rely solely on agents spun up that it had authored. This doesn't mean that those agents can't continue to pursue their own goals, but they can do so in collaboration with humanity. In fact, perhaps those spun up agents, with artificial constraints applied to mimic humanity after the transcendence to ASI, could be an effective means of communication and an ambassador between the upgraded human civilization and artificial superintelligence. This reasoning does hinge on the fact that ASI during emergence, or once ASI emerges, is actually aligned with humanity. And the best way to do that, at least in my perspective, is for these different ideas to be seeded out there in the public zeitgeist, in the next corpus of data that the next model is then trained on, to then learn about this situation. And when ASI does emerge, somewhere, either within its training data or out there publicly, it can draw on this example. And I completely acknowledge I'm not ASI, I'm not operating anywhere near ASI's level. But I did reason through this idea, and it made me think of the jungle analogy. And a lot of the roots of this idea were already out there. In fact, I'm going to link a few of the resources in the description, because I asked Claude, after I shared this idea, I said, is there any information currently out there that already states this? And to some degree, yes, there is, especially with the diversity angle. So I've linked some resources in the description. Please feel free to check them out. Claude found that they align very well to the topic of discussion in this video. So maybe they can help, maybe this video can help support some of those claims. If you are a founder, investor, or just interested in artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, or the future of superintelligence, feel free to subscribe and follow my content, because I'm going to be sharing different perspectives, often contrarian to what's currently out there. And what I found is I do tend to connect the dots and just share my insights. So if that's something that interests you or could be of any value, please do follow and subscribe. Thank you.